threw himself across the trembling body of the Scion just as the second explosion turned the docking bay into a sun. White heat roared over his back, searing through his reinforced environment suit like it was parchment. Beneath him, the young Zenith Royal let out a sharp, bird-like cry, her four eyes wide with a terror that transcended species. Everything went white. The fire is coming, but the story is just beginning. Join us to see how a single human changed the fate of the stars. Now, back to the Prism Hub. 5 hours earlier, the hardest decision Kalen had faced was whether to calibrate the oxygen scrubbers before or after his mid-shift protein ration. The Prism Hub was quiet then, a massive spinning wheel of chrome and glass hanging in the neutral zone between three warring empires. As a senior maintenance engineer, Kalen preferred the quiet problems, the ones he could solve with a wrench and a bit of patience. The Zenith matriarch arrived with a flourish of silver banners and a fleet of jagged warships that made the station's docking pylons groan. It was a high-stakes summit, the kind where one wrong word could ignite a sector. Kalen watched the procession from a service catwalk, his wrist-mounted diagnostic console chirping softly as it scanned the environmental load of so many new arrivals. The little holographic screen glowed amber, a routine notification he barely glanced at. Prism Hub was neutral ground, but neutrality is a fragile thing. He spent the next 3 hours in the crawl spaces of Aperture Prime, the station's most prestigious docking bay. The air smelled of ozone and expensive alien perfumes. The Zenith Scion, a girl no older than a human teenager, had wandered away from her mother's security detail to stare at the stars through the reinforced viewport. Kalen kept his distance, focusing on the conduit seals. He noticed the fluctuation first on his wrist-mounted diagnostic console. It wasn't a mechanical failure. The energy spikes were rhythmic, intentional, and originating from inside the primary fuel manifold of the matriarch's own shuttle, which meant the readings were wrong. Kalen tapped the console, his brow furrowing. It wasn't the scrubbers, it wasn't the fuel, it was a bypass. Someone had rigged the bay's fire suppression system to fail before the primary charges went off. Most species calculate the cost of a life. Humans just calculate the distance to the fire. Kalen didn't call it in. There wasn't time. The signal was already cascading. He dropped his wrench, the heavy tool clattering against the deck plates with a lonely ring. He began to run. The first explosion was a wet thump that buckled the inner bulkhead. The Scion screamed as a support pillar collapsed, pinning her iridescent robes to the floor. Alien guards in heavy ceramic armor immediately surged backward, following their tactical retreat protocols to protect the matriarch. They were built for war, for the defense of the crown, not for the rescue of a trapped girl in a collapsing furnace. Kalen didn't have armor. He had a work suit and a diagnostic tool. Do you think a single person's choice can actually stop a war between empires? I'd love to hear your thoughts. He reached her just as the ceiling began to weep molten lead. The heat was a physical wall, pushing against his lungs. The Scion's eyes were fixed on the secondary fuel tank, which was venting a high-pitched, screaming whistle of supercritical gas. It was going to blow, and it was going to take the entire docking arm with it. Kalen didn't think about the heat or the way the skin on his arms was beginning to bubble. There was only the weight of the girl and the red-hot pillar pinning her down. He jammed his shoulder under the metal, his boots slipping on the slick, scorched deck. The air was a roar of escaping gases. With a scream that tore his throat, he heaved. The pillar shifted just enough for the Scion to scramble backward, her claws clicking against the floor. Kalen collapsed into the space she had occupied, curling his body around her just as the secondary manifold gave way. The world shattered. It wasn't just noise. It was a pressure that tried to turn his bones to powder. He felt his suit fuse to the deck, felt the searing kiss of the blast wave, and then blissful, cold darkness. 3 days later, the darkness broke into a clinical white hum. Kalen opened his eyes to find himself suspended in a Zenith healing vat, his body wrapped in translucent synth skin. Standing beyond the glass was the matriarch. She was a towering figure of obsidian scales and grief, her presence heavy enough to warp the air. Beside her stood the Scion, bandaged but alive. In the Zenith Collective, a blood debt isn't a thank you, it's a transformation of destiny. The matriarch's voice didn't come from her throat. It vibrated directly into Kalen's mind. She offered him worlds. She offered him a fleet of his own, or enough wealth to buy a moon in the Terran system. Kalen looked at his hands, still trembling beneath the medical gel. He thought of the guards who had retreated. He thought of the quiet problems on the station. "I don't want a moon," Kalen rasped, the words scratching against his raw lungs. "I want the Terran Union to manage the conduits." The matriarch's advisors hissed, their crests rising in offense. But Kalen pressed on, his voice gaining a thin, sharp edge. He didn't ask for territory. He asked for the boring stuff. The maintenance of the jump gates, the repair of the deep space relays, and the logistics of the trade routes. The galaxy was built on the bones of empires that were too strong to bend, but too rigid to survive. Kalen explained that if humans were the ones holding the wrenches, no one would dare pull the trigger. If you control the infrastructure, war becomes an expense that even an immortal empress cannot afford. You don't need to be the strongest if you are the most necessary. It was a radical proposal, altruism as a tactical chokehold. A week later, Kalen sat on the edge of his recovery bed, looking at his wrist-mounted diagnostic console. The casing was charred, the screen cracked, but the internal clock was still ticking. The matriarch had signed. Already the first Terran engineering frigates were docking at Zenith outposts, not with cannons, but with fusion welders and blueprints. The connective tissue was forming. Kalen tapped the cracked screen of his console, watching the blue lines of new trade routes ripple across the galactic map. He was just a mechanic who had calculated the distance to a fire, yet he had accidentally built a cage of peace that not even an empire could break. He leaned back, the hum of the station finally sounding right again. The tool that tracked a disaster now charted a new era of history. If you could change one thing about how the world works today using only technology, what would it be? Thanks for being part of the Chronicle. I'll see you in the next sector.